Kali is a little different this time, and we're going to use it to make our first real virus, so we can take a look at that. Alrighty? If you have not done so, you should always try and come to this class and have your VM up and running. Even if we don't use it, you can always shut it off and it'll only cost you a couple of minutes. It's really not that big of a deal. Once your VM is up and running, you can click on the little icon that looks like a computer on a network, and it'll let you open up your RDP client. I'm going to open it with RDP software, and as I said before, the that should start your RDP session. Please note that the performance this week is better than the performance we had last week. Okay? Is anybody not at this point? Okay. Okay. Also good. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to get there. Okay, it should be up and running now, Prince. So not seeing anything in the browser, just refresh the browser page and then take a look at the clicking on the RDP link. Okay. Now, just by way of verification, everybody has VirtualBox set up and everybody has Remnux installed. Is this true? Yep. Okay, good. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Remnux in our next class to analyze the virus that we're going to create in our next class. Unfortunately, the process of creating the VM necessary is quite long, so all we're going to do today is focus on getting Kali Linux running in our environment. Okay? So one of the first things we need to do is download Kali, and this is one of the few times where being on the Azure infrastructure is quite beneficial, because they're on a backplane that has some very high speed to it, and there is no throttling of that network speed. So if you Google Kali download, just like that, it will take you to the Kali's download page. Okay? I don't care how you get here, but search for the Kali's download or go kali.org/downloads. And I want you to download the Kali 64-bit installer. It's the first link on the page. You should all be able to see it. It's right there. Click on that and save the file. And this is where it really shines. If you take a look at the transfer rate, the download, well, this morning it was around 90 megabytes per second. Right now it's around 105 megabytes per second. Long story short, it's downloading a very large file very, very fast. It's one of the few benefits of doing this on Azure is that we can download our software quite quickly. Okay? We're going to let it run. It shouldn't take more than a minute to download the software, and then we'll get ready to set up a virtual machine and install Kali. This process is a little bit different than the last time we installed Kali, in that you can more finely dial in exactly what you want to do. Okay. You don't have to just install everything. You can do a minimum install, an average install, or a complete install. Also, you no longer log in as root by default. You log in as something else and become root as necessary. So Kali is trying to convert itself into more of a daily driver Linux rather than a pen test tool that people only use when they're attacking and they only log in as root. I don't know if I agree with that, but it's still a pretty good tool, so we're going to keep using it. Okay? Has everybody downloaded Kali? The downloads should appear right here. And if you want, like I'm in my down folder, if you want, you could move that into your not scanned folder. That's what I would do, because I don't want Windows Defender taking a look at that. All right. That's better. Okay. So I've moved it into that folder. That way Windows Defender isn't going to scan it and nothing unusual is going to happen. I honestly don't think anything would, but it's always, I like to be a little extra careful when dealing with potentially dangerous malware. All right. So as we've done in the past with Kali, we are going to create a new virtual machine. Okay. I wasn't recording. Oh, I am recording. Yes, I am recording. So that's good. So now we're just going to go through the regular process as we have done so many times before. We're going to create a new virtual machine. We type in UBU, and then it automatically, I don't know who's recording this, but that's fine. It is Ubuntu 64, but that's not what we're going to call it. Just call it Kali, like that, K-A-L-I. Thing is that I've already got a machine called Kali, so I'm going to call this one Kali Section 2 to differentiate between the two different, the three different instances of Kali that I have now. And click on Next. You can call it whatever you want. You should be able to call it Kali. There's a very real chance we're going to delete it before the semester is over anyway, so it's fine. At this point, you want to give yourself 8 gig or 8,192 megabytes of RAM. Use the slider. It's the easiest way. It'll pause a little bit around the 8 gig mark, and that's what we want to set. Click on Next. Now we create a hard drive. We could import a hard drive. We could bypass this process. We could use an existing one, but we're going to create a hard disk, clicking on the default Create. The default type is fine. Click on Next. Dynamic, the default physical storage type is fine. Click on Next. And finally, the way that we're going to set up Kali, this would be fine as well. But I don't want you to get into that habit. Anytime you set up Kali, I want you to give yourself 20 gig of hard drive space. Strictly speaking, you probably won't need it. Certainly for this one, we're only going to use about 5 gig of drive space. But even by setting it at 20 gig, it's only going to grow into that size as long as it needs more space. Because it's only going to need about 5 gig of space, the file at the end of the day is going to be around 5.5 gigabytes in size. And that's fine. We don't need it any bigger than that anyway. Still, by setting it at 20, you have gotten into this habit of setting that at the right size in case you decide to install everything. So, find, default, until you get to this file location and size. And on this one, we want to set it to 20 gig and click on Create. It will finish the wizard, it will create the virtual machine, and as always, we need to go through and make some tweaks. Click on the system. As we said, 8 gig is fine. Maybe give yourself a second processor. So I go to Settings, go to System, Motherboard tab is fine, Processor tab, change that to 2 gig. You can also use the up and down arrows over here. Display, you probably don't need to change this. Change that to 128 megabytes as well. Scale that all the way off to the side. Storage, we are going to need to add the CD-ROM that we just downloaded. Correction, the DVD that we just downloaded. Okay, so in the Storage tab, select the empty CD-ROM right off to the right side of the dialog box. Click and select Choose a Disk File. When you do that, you can go to Downloads, you can go into the folder, and then select the Kali installer. Click on Open, and your dialog box should look like this. You have your Kali hard drive, and then you have your Kali install CD-ROM. It'll say Kali Linux 2020.3 installer, and then it'll scroll off to the side, which is fine. Okay. And then finally, as we often do, we need to add a second adapter. Adapter 1 is fine. Adapter 2, add, attach it to the host-only network. Go to Advanced, promiscuous mode, allow all. Click on OK, and you should be ready to start your VM. Any questions? Please start your VM at this time. Clicking on Start. Is everybody at this point? Are there any questions? Yes, go ahead. So when you see this and it says select startup disk, just choose in the down arrow and make sure it says Kali Linux installer and click on Start. Okay? I don't know why it keeps doing that. It's a new, let's call it a feature. It's not what I'm looking for, but you should all get to this point. Is anybody not at this point? Everybody's at this point? Okay, perfect. So as always, we're going to use the graphical install. So just, you can click in there. If you click in there, it says, hey, do you want to capture? Just click on cancel and hit enter. The graphical install should work. You don't use the mouse yet until after you load the graphical libraries. That happens in the very early stages of the installer. Perfect. And now our pointer probably is loaded properly within Kali. Specifically, sorry, the Kali installer. It's not Kali yet, it's just the Kali installer. Okay? And even though our mouse works, we can do a lot of this with just the keyboard. As always, I recommend that you use the English language for your language settings. Not because there's anything wrong with any other language out there. It's just, as I've said before, it has to do with people who develop software and don't use language pack libraries properly. If you don't do the language pack properly, anybody who chooses a language other than the language you developed in, which is more often than not English, is not going to have a good experience using the software. So just to, especially, and I mean, let's be honest, especially with a library of hacking tools, the chances are that everybody did the language packs properly is slim to none. So we're going to assume everything will work with English. We select English, and then we move on to select your country. Okay? I hit C for Canada, and it takes me right to Canada, and I can hit Enter again. It wants to know the keyboard. American English is usually fine, so again, I'm just going to hit Enter. So that was English, Enter, hit C for Canada, Enter, and then American English, hit Enter. Okay? It's reading a bunch of tools off of the install media. Normally we would have been done if this was done on our own machines. The file I.O. is a little slow on the cloud, but it does work. Okay? I believe it is still pulling content off of the CD-ROM. If you're ever uncertain, you can just look at the status bar across the bottom of this Kali virtual machine window. If you look at the status bar, you can see that the CD-ROM I.O. is flashing, so it's reading off of the CD-ROM. It's good to know what's going on. If you recall, we set up two network adapters when we first configured our machine after we initially set it up. We have to tell it which one to use. Again, I expect you to know your environment, but let's take a look. I set up two network adapters. One was on NAT, adapter 2 was on the host-only network. During the installation, they want to install to the adapter that gives them access to the internet. That's going to be the primary one. It should be the first one, ENP0S3. So with it highlighted, click Enter. Okay. And now it wants to continue on with some of the network settings, including machine and network name. We don't use machine names, and we use the host name as part of the prompt, so I like to keep it nice and short. Kali is fine. But because everything is referenced via IP address, what you choose to name these things really doesn't matter. So for me, Kali is fine. The domain name is opsys, not oopssys, opsys.bit. You could leave this blank just as well because, again, we use IP addresses, not the naming scheme. Okay? Any questions? Is everybody at this point? This is the first deviation for Kali that we've seen that we haven't seen in the past. In the past, we wouldn't be asked to set up a new user. In the past, we would just use the root account. You would set the root password and you would move on and not worry about anything else. As I said, however, you no longer log into Kali as root. You log in as a regular user, just like we used to do with Debian. So you need to specify a username. I just specify the user ID I'm going to use later on, and then it'll recommend that as the user ID for the account. Okay, so I typed in SJ and SJ. You type in a nice short username that you want to use as well, and it'll make it a valid twice. After that, what I will do is I will type in a real easy password to use. Again, this is a closed ecosystem inside of a closed ecosystem. I don't really have to worry about setting a secure password. If this was in your careers going forward, chances are this would also be set up inside of a closed architecture, so you could be a little bit loosey-goosey with the password rules, but if you were to deploy a server in a production environment, of course you never want to use the password. Okay? So I've set a password for my username SJ. You need to remember the username and password you set. Specify central for central standard time or central daylight time. And next thing we are going to do is set up our hard drive partitions. We have defined a 20 gig partition. We're going to tell it to use the entire 20 gigs for one drive. So at this point, again, just like it was in the wizard when it came to the hard drives, the defaults are going to be by and large okay. Guided, use the entire disk? Yes. Continue. The default? Continue. The default, all the partitions in one? Yes. Default. And then at the end it says, do you want to write these changes to the disk? The default? Yes. So it's default, 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 default until you get to this screen. It says if you continue, the list will be written to your disks, which can't be undone easily. It can be undone with data recovery techniques, but that's outside the scope of this. So write changes to the disk. You actually have to either hit the Y key on your keyboard, hit the down arrow, cursor key, or click on the word yes and continue. You have to make these changes to your hard disk before it formats it and starts populating it with files. Any questions? Questions? Does that make sense? Okay, so it's setting up some basic stuff on the hard drive so that we can go forward and actually start choosing the software we want to install. Again, our status bar tells us what's going on. The red flashing light is indicating a lot of file I/O, in this case file writes, to our virtual hard drive. That's a good thing. That means that the install is progressing, and that's what we want to see. As I mentioned earlier, this will take some time. Any questions? Is anybody, and please be honest, is anybody not at this point in the installation? Please be honest. Okay. Okay, Imanshu, do you want to talk about what problem you're having? It shouldn't matter. It really shouldn't matter, because really at the end of the day, you should be able to start up your virtual machine and go into VirtualBox and just add Kali. Okay, if you can get on track, that's great. I'll be out tonight. I'll keep an eye on my phone. If you want, reach out to me in the chat log in Teams and I'll try and answer. But please understand, I will not be near a computer. So I'll try and help as best I can. Okay, and that goes for all of you. I'm heading out to my fishing club tonight. I'm not going to be available to work on a computer, but I can at least try and answer questions via the chat log. Yes, of course, sir. Of course. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else not at this point? Alrighty. Yeah, this is a slow-moving process, but as long as we have I/O happening down here, it's a good sign. If it sits and doesn't change at all, that's when you start worrying. It is possible that during this installation, you will get a disconnection notice and it'll try and reconnect and it'll try 20 times. If that happens to you, don't bother. Cancel, go back into your browser, power off your virtual machine, power it back on, and start the install again. Okay? If you're installing Kali or Windows when it happens in the future, and you get a disconnection, which has happened a couple of times today. It happened to me twice this morning when I was trying to get ready for today's class. If that happens, power off Windows. Oh, you don't have to power off Windows. It's already powered off. Go into your browser, power off your virtual machine, power it back on, and reconnect and restart the install. But that's only if you get disconnected. Don't just do it all the time. Only do it when you get disconnected. Now, at this point, hopefully you are going to see this software selection menu. It's not something we've seen in the past with Kali, but basically we're only going to install a couple of things. We're going to install XFCE and the top 10 tools. The other two checkboxes that are there, the desktop and the collection of tools, as you can see that selecting this item has no effect. It doesn't matter, so we're going to leave them alone. The important thing is that checkbox 2 is highlighted and checkbox 6 is highlighted. We're going to use XFCE and we're going to use the top 10. We're not going to do default or large. We don't need those tools, and frankly, it's just going to take our installer and make it run longer. We're not going to use GNOME or KDE Plasma. We've always used the XFCE interface. We're going to continue to use XFCE. So, if you could ensure that you only have desktop XFCE, collection, and top 10, everything else should be clear. 4 checkbox, 4 clear boxes. Okay? And then click on continue. Again, you can see the Cd-Rom reads happening, and then once it gets the files, you start seeing file I/O happening on the hard drive. This is going to take a while, at least 10 or 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop lecturing for right now. I'm going to pause recording the video. Okay, so I know somebody else is recording this through Teams. That's fine. I'm recording this on my desktop, which is also fine. So as I was saying, once you've gone through and done the software configuration, the process will run basically 10 to 15 minutes on its own. Again, the hard drive subsystem used on these virtual machines isn't the same as what we have on our desktop, so the file write process is a little slower. Regardless, you will get to the point where you can install the Grub bootloader, and it says, do you want to install it on your primary drive? So when you see this, select yes and continue. And just like when we were writing the partition table to the hard drive, we need to tell Kali installer where to install Grub. We said install it, now we're saying where, and we have to tell it because again, it's one of those things that can change the hard drive. So the installer saying, are you sure you want to do this? And it's doing that by asking you to confirm where you want it installed. There's really only one place to select. The other one requires you enter it manually. You want to select /dev/SDA and click on continue. It will then go ahead and install the Grub bootloader. Okay. It'll also go ahead and install Oracle extra tools for you as well. It's setting up the username passwords, it's doing a little bit of extra stuff, but it's also going to install the necessary tools for Linux to get the guest tools working with VirtualBox. The Linux headers and some other Linux tools are all necessary to get VirtualBox working a little bit better in Kali. So it's actually taking care of that for us. It's also going to install the VirtualBox Guest Editions software as well. This is something I haven't seen Kali do in the past, or I certainly haven't noticed Kali doing in the past, and it's a nice little touch. I like that. We're not really going to use it, but it's nice to know that the installer takes care of that for us. Unfortunately, it adds about 3 or 4 minutes to the install, but we'll let it run its course. Are there any questions? Maybe a little longer than 3 or 4 minutes. It's going to take as long as it takes. There you go. There's some hard drive I/O right there. That's good. Worst thing that could happen is that this install fails at this point, because we are within a minute or two of it being complete, and if it fails now, we have to restart the whole thing. It's unfortunate, but true. Although maybe there's enough installed at this point that it will recover. I don't know. We'll have to see. Perfect. So now, after it is done, those final steps, it's saying, hey, it's time to reboot. So what you want to do now is say, hey, no problem, click on continue, and the Kali installer will reboot the virtual machine after it deletes some temporary install files. It'll go through and it'll do the Kali reboot for us, and this time we can boot not into the Kali installer, but actually into the Kali operating system, or the Kali instance of Ubuntu, which would be technically more correct. When it first boots up, I hit enter, so it just boots a little faster. You don't have to. It will default to that within a few seconds. If you get to this point, Kali should be installed and ready to go. Even if it crashes now, you've got Kali installed. Just like Remnux, if you get past the installer, Remnux should be in place and ready to go. Same with Kali. Same with Windows, by the way. Once you get Windows going, it should be good to go. A lot of file I/O happening, but it is happening, and that's the good sign. And that should look familiar to you. And that's exactly what we want to see. This is the Kali login that we used to log in with root before. It's not an option until we set a password for root, which we won't really talk about, but you can do on your own. We're going to log in as the user ID we created during the install. And of course, supplying the correct password that you defined during the installation as well. Alrighty. Now the quirky thing is that even though we're not root, we can do a lot of root-like activities. First thing I always do is I resize it so I have a little bit more real estate to work with. Also, anytime you set up a new virtual machine in our environment, the first thing you want to do is verify the network settings. Because our network configuration isn't typical for whatever reason. It's typical for what you see in industry, but it's not typical in how people normally set these things up. So the first thing we always do is verify our network. The IP adder command will tell us what's going on. Right away, I can see something unexpected. My host-only network is working. My NAT network is not working. Usually it's the other way around. Usually NAT is working and host only isn't. Regardless, I know ETH0 needs to be configured, and ETH1 is probably okay. Okay? Again, once I got into Kali, I made it a little bigger for myself so I could see it a little bit better. I opened up a terminal. And I checked the IP addresses. First things first, my ETH0 or my NAT adapter is no longer working. It clearly worked before because it downloaded and installed software. So it's not working now. I need to fix that. My ETH1 is okay. So it's ETH0 I need to resolve. Up here, there's really only one connection available, wired connection 1. So I need to change that. Click away and right-click on the little icon that looks like a network. Right-click and select Edit Connections, just like we did last semester with our Kali. Again, how did I do that? I right-click on the little icon that looks like a network port, and when my mouse is on top of it, it says Ethernet Network Connection, Wired Connection 1 active. Right-click and select Edit Connections. We only have one connection. That's Wired Connection 1. That's the one that ETH1 is using. We're going to add a new connection by clicking on the plus. The default is fine. Click on Create. Again, how did I do that? Click on the little plus on the lower left corner. Specify the default type. Ethernet is fine. Click on Create. It'll create a new connection, it'll give it a name, and we need to select the device that isn't working. ETH0 isn't working, I'm going to select ETH0. If your ETH0 is working and ETH1 isn't, select the one that isn't working. Verify your IPv4 settings, verify that it's grabbing an IP address through DHCP, click on Save. Okay, you should now have 2 different connections. If you want, you can tell the wired one, this is the one we just created. We can click on Settings, and it shows that that's ETH0. Cancel. If you want, you can go tell ETH or Wired Connection 1 to use ETH1. You don't have to do that. It's entirely up to you. But verify that one is using one connection, and if you need to, verify that the other is using the other connection. Okay? You should be able to close this down and test your IP settings again. And right away, my ETH0 is using NAT. My ETH1 is using my host-only network. Any questions? Does that make sense? Alrighty. Sometimes you need to go up here and click with the left mouse button and tell it to use. If it doesn't say disconnect, it's not connected, and you have to select a connection for it. It should be pretty obvious. Select the one that's not being used. Okay? But at the end of the day, you want to see this. If you don't see this, let me know, and we'll work through it together. Any questions? Is everybody at this point? If you're not at this point, let me know. Okay? Those of you who haven't already told me. Okay. Last thing I want you to do before you shut down everything is to exit properly. Inside your terminal window, type exit. So close down terminal. Select the power button in the upper right corner. Yeah, I just lost my connection. You see how it's not responding? I just lost my connection just now. So if you see something like this, I hope everybody's watching the display. If you see something like this, this is a dropped connection. This is what I was talking about before. You can let it try and reconnect. I have never seen it on the Azure network successfully reconnect. If you get this dropped connection when you're installing, reinstall. If you get this dropped connection after you have installed, wow, whoa, it came back. That's pretty good. Again, you may have to type in the password again. Let's see if that worked. Yeah, you see it shut down my VM even though I didn't shut it down. That's no good. You don't want to see that, but my VM was installed, so I'm okay. More importantly, shut down your VM. I'm not going to show that. Yeah, I am. Sorry, I am going to show this. This is how I want you to shut down Kali. You guys are section 2, yes? It's going to take a second, sorry. It's a nice secondary test anyway. I can now verify that my network settings were proper because I was able to restart my VM and see that I still have the same network settings working. So this is a happy mess up, let's call it that. Should, under normal situations, it should redo the window size I had before, but given how it crashed, it might not have kept that setting, so we'll have to see. Normally though, if you set up a different window size, it should rediscover that window size when it restarts. Again, the username password you defined. Hey, there it is. That's perfect. The username password you defined when you set up the user account during the installation. We'll let it catch up to us. I got to say, I like that wallpaper. The new wallpaper that it has, that's pretty cool. I like that. All right, so this is what I was trying to do before. After you have exited out of your terminal window, I want you to select the power option and select shutdown. Don't just power off by hitting the X. No, no, no. Select the power button and select shutdown. It will do an elegant shutdown of your virtual machines, and that's what I want. These things are tricky enough running in the Azure environment. We want to make sure we take good care of them. Shut them down properly, please. Once it's shut down, once it is shut down, you can also shut down VirtualBox. I'm guessing something wasn't completed when it was doing the initial startup, and now it's trying to time out, but that's okay. For argument's sake, we can also just, there, I didn't shut it down. I was about to, but it shut itself down. Perfect. That's what we want. Now that our VM is properly shut down, Start menu on your malware VM, power, and shut down. Shut down your Linux virtual machine or machines, shut down Windows, and then finally go into your VirtualBox environment and power off your virtual machine. There's a little toggle switch right here, shows that it is running. After you shut down your Windows malware VM, power it off through your Azure Lab Services webpage, through your portal page that you used to have for your VMs. Okay, so the shutdown process I want you to do every day. Shut down your Linux VMs, shut down your malware Windows VM, and then shut down the Azure VM in that order. Okay? Every single day. Are there any questions? I'm going to stop